Captain Marcus Johnson sighed contentedly as he settled into his plush first-class seat. The soft leather embraced him, a welcome respite from the rigors of his usual position in the cockpit. Today, he was just another passenger, albeit one with a unique perspective on air travel. Dressed in comfortable jeans and a casual button-down shirt, he blended seamlessly with the other first-class travelers boarding the transcontinental flight from New York to Los Angeles. As he stowed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, Marcus couldn't help but smile. It wasn't often that he got to experience the luxuries of first-class travel from this side of the cockpit door. His dark skin glistened with a thin sheen of sweat, a testament to the humid New York summer he'd just escaped. He pulled out a dog-eared copy of The Right Stuff from his bag before taking his seat. A bit of light reading about the golden age of aviation seemed appropriate for the journey. The hustle and bustle of boarding continued around him as Marcus cracked open his book. He was vaguely aware of the steady stream of passengers filing past, some casting curious glances his way. It wasn't uncommon for him to draw attention. Even in 2024, a black man in first class was still something of a rarity on many flights. As the last of the first-class passengers settled in, a flight attendant began making her rounds. Sarah, as her name tag identified her, was a petite blonde with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved efficiently from passenger to passenger, offering pre-flight drinks and ensuring everyone was comfortable. When she reached Marcus, however, her smile faltered for just a moment. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice low and measured. "I believe there may have been a mistake with your seating assignment. May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus looked up from his book, momentarily confused. He reached into his pocket and produced the ticket, handing it over without comment. Sarah examined it closely, her brow furrowing as she looked from the ticket to Marcus and back again. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an error," she said, her voice taking on a slightly patronizing tone. "This ticket is for first class, but I'm afraid we don't have any more first-class seats available. I'll need to ask you to move to the economy section." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the request. He'd encountered subtle forms of discrimination before, but this was remarkably blatant. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," he replied calmly. "My ticket clearly states that this is my assigned seat. Is there a problem with the booking system?" Sarah's smile tightened, her eyes darting nervously to the other passengers who were beginning to take notice of the exchange. "Sir, I assure you, there's no problem with our system. However, this section is reserved for our premium passengers. I'm sure you can understand the confusion, given your appearance." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger and resignation that he'd hoped he'd left behind years ago when he'd earned his captain's stripes. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that escalating the situation would only make things worse. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that I am in the correct seat. If you'd like to double-check with your supervisor, I'd be happy to wait." Sarah's smile had completely vanished now, replaced by a look of barely concealed irritation. "Sir, I am the lead flight attendant on this flight. I'm asking you nicely to gather your belongings and move to the economy section. We have passengers waiting to board, and I need this seat for its intended occupant." Marcus felt the eyes of the other first-class passengers on him, some curious, others uncomfortable, and a few openly hostile. He had a choice to make: reveal his identity as a pilot and potentially embarrass Sarah, or comply with her request and deal with the injustice later. As much as it pained him, he decided to take the path of least resistance, for now. "Very well," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I'll move. But I want to speak to the captain about this before we take off." Sarah's relief was palpable as Marcus gathered his things. "Of course, sir. I'm sure the captain will be happy to explain our seating policies to you." As Marcus made his way to the economy section, he couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. How many times had he been judged, dismissed, or underestimated because of the color of his skin, and how many more times would he have to prove himself before people saw beyond their preconceptions? Little did Sarah know that her actions were about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not only her assumptions, but those of everyone on board. As Marcus took his new seat in economy, his mind was already racing, planning how to turn this moment of injustice into a teachable moment for all involved. As Marcus settled into his cramped economy seat, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. The stark contrast between the spacious first-class cabin he'd just left and his current surroundings was a physical reminder of the discrimination he'd just faced. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he'd faced far worse in his journey to become a commercial airline pilot. The economy cabin was a cacophony of sounds and movements as passengers struggled to find space for their carry-ons and settled into their seats. Marcus observed it all with a professional eye, noting the efficiency of the crew and the general mood of the passengers. It was second nature to him, even when he wasn't in the cockpit. As he was about to return to his book, Marcus noticed Sarah, the flight attendant from first class, making her way down the aisle. She was speaking with another crew member, gesturing animatedly. When she spotted Marcus, her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly averted her gaze. It was clear she was still discussing the situation with her colleague. Moments later, Sarah approached Marcus, her professional smile back in place, though it seemed more strained than before. "Sir," she began, her voice low to avoid drawing attention. "I've spoken with my colleague, and we believe there may have been a misunderstanding earlier. Could you please show me your boarding pass again?" Marcus raised an eyebrow but complied, handing over the ticket once more. Sarah examined it closely, her brow furrowing as she looked from the ticket to Marcus and back again. "I see," she said slowly. "It does appear that you were initially assigned a first-class seat. However, I'm afraid there's been an overbooking situation, and we've had to reassign some passengers. I apologize for the inconvenience." The explanation rang hollow to Marcus's ears. He'd been in the airline industry long enough to know when someone was trying to cover their tracks. "I see," he replied evenly. "And was I the only passenger who needed to be reassigned due to this overbooking?" Sarah's smile faltered for a moment. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other passengers' arrangements, sir. But I can assure you that we're doing our best to accommodate everyone." Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Ms. Sarah, I think we both know what's really going on here. I'd like to speak to the captain before we take off, as I requested earlier." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Sir, the captain is busy with pre-flight preparations. I'm sure you understand how important those are for everyone's safety." The irony of her statement was not lost on Marcus. "Perhaps we can arrange for you to speak with someone from customer service once we land in Los Angeles." Marcus shook his head. "I'm afraid that won't do. This is a matter that needs to be addressed before we depart. I have every right to be in first class, and I'd like to know exactly why I was singled out for this reassignment, me." Sarah's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Sir, I've explained the situation to you. We have policies and procedures in place for a reason. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to drop this matter and prepare for takeoff like the rest of the passengers." As their conversation continued, Marcus noticed other passengers starting to take an interest. Some were openly staring, while others pretended to be engrossed in their in-flight magazines or phones, all the while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. A middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned over. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Before Marcus could respond, Sarah interjected, "Everything's fine, ma'am. Just a minor seating issue we're resolving." Her tone made it clear that the conversation was not open for public discussion. Marcus, however, saw an opportunity. "Actually," he said, addressing both the woman and Sarah, "I was originally seated in first class, but I've been asked to move without any clear explanation. I'm simply trying to understand why." The woman's eyes widened, and she looked from Marcus to Sarah, clearly unsure how to respond. Sarah's smile became even more forced. "Sir, as I've explained, it was a necessary reassignment due to overbooking. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish preparing the cabin for takeoff." As Sarah turned to leave, Marcus called after her. I still want to speak to the captain. I'll wait here, but I expect this to be resolved before we take off." Sarah paused, visibly conflicted. Finally, she nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do," she said, before hurrying away. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus could feel the tension in the cabin growing. Whispers and curious glances were directed his way, and he knew that his stand was causing a stir. But he also knew that sometimes, standing up for what's right meant making others uncomfortable. He settled back into his seat, his mind racing. How would this situation play out? Would the captain intervene? And what would happen when the truth of his identity finally came to light? As the engines began to rumble to life, Marcus prepared himself for whatever might come next. Little did he know that the most surprising turn of events was yet to come. The low hum of the engines reverberated through the cabin as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Marcus sat rigid in his economy seat, his jaw clenched, as the tension in the air seemed to thicken with each passing moment. The whispers and sideways glances from nearby passengers had evolved into more open curiosity and, in some cases, outright concern. A young woman 2 rows ahead kept turning around to look at him, her brow furrowed in what appeared to be a mixture of sympathy and confusion. An older gentleman across the aisle had removed his reading glasses and was openly staring, his weathered face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Marcus could almost see the gears turning in the man's head, trying to reconcile the well-spoken, dignified black man before him with his own preconceptions. Sarah, the flight attendant who had been the catalyst for this entire situation, was conspicuously absent. Marcus had noticed her hurrying back and forth in the front of the economy cabin, speaking in hushed tones with other crew members and casting furtive glances his way. It was clear that his request to speak with the captain had thrown a wrench into the usual pre-flight routine. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus could feel his frustration mounting. He was accustomed to being in control, to having a clear understanding of every situation he found himself in. But here, stripped of his uniform and his authority, he felt powerless in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It was a stark reminder of the battles he'd fought to get where he was, and of the battles that still lay ahead for people who looked like him. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and a flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for takeoff. Marcus's heart sank. It seemed that his request to speak with the captain would go unheeded. Just then, a commotion at the front of the cabin caught his attention. Sarah was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with another crew member. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke volumes. Sarah's face was flushed, her gestures animated as she seemed to be pleading her case. The other crew member, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, looked stern and unyielding. As Marcus watched, the man's eyes suddenly locked onto his. There was a moment of recognition, followed by what Marcus could only describe as dawning horror. The man quickly turned back to Sarah, said something that made her blanch, and then began making his way down the aisle toward Marcus. The other passengers, sensing that something significant was about to happen, fell into an expectant hush. Even the constant background noise of shuffling bags and clicking seatbelts seemed to fade away. The man reached Marcus's row and leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Captain Johnson?" he said, the question more of a formality than a real inquiry. "I'm First Officer Derek Stevens. There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding. Would you please come with me?" A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the nearby passengers. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation. Did he say, "Captain? I thought he was just another passenger? Oh my God, what have they done?" Marcus stood slowly, his eyes never leaving First Officer Stevens' face. "I'd be happy to," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I believe I have some things to discuss with the crew." As they made their way to the front of the plane, Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin on him. The whispers had grown louder, a mix of outrage, embarrassment, and disbelief. He caught sight of Sarah, standing rigid by the galley, her face a mask of mortification. First Officer Stevens led Marcus to the cockpit door, pausing before he opened it. "Captain," he said, his voice heavy with regret, I want to apologize on behalf of the entire crew. This should never have happened." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the apology, but not quite ready to accept it. As the cockpit door swung open, he straightened his shoulders and stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. The familiar environment of the cockpit, with its myriad of instruments and controls, felt like a homecoming. But the faces of the crew members inside, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and dawning recognition, reminded him that this was far from a normal day at work. As the door closed behind him, Marcus took a deep breath. The next few moments would be crucial, not just for him, but for everyone on this flight. He had an opportunity here, an opportunity to turn this humiliating experience into a teachable moment, to challenge assumptions and break down barriers. As he prepared to address the crew, he silently vowed to make the most of it. Little did Marcus know that his actions in the next few minutes would not only change the course of this flight, but would ripple out to affect the lives of everyone on board in ways none of them could have anticipated. The true test of his character and leadership was about to begin. The cockpit fell into an uneasy silence as Captain Marcus Johnson stepped inside. The confined space seemed to shrink even further as the weight of the situation settled upon everyone present. The current captain, a middle-aged man with graying temples, stood from his seat, his face a mixture of confusion and growing realization. "Captain Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Robert Chen. I'm not sure I understand what's happening here." Marcus shook the offered hand firmly, his demeanor professional despite the churning emotions beneath the surface. "Captain Chen, it seems there's been a significant misunderstanding. I was supposed to be your relief for the second leg of this flight, but due to some issues with the cabin crew, I was removed from my first-class seat and relegated to economy." Captain Chen's eyes widened, darting between Marcus and First Officer Stevens, who had followed them into the cockpit. "Removed from first class? But why on earth?" He stopped short, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I believe there were some assumptions made about my right to be in the first-class cabin, based on my appearance." The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Chen's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and anger clouding his features. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I assure you, Captain Johnson, this will be dealt with immediately." As if on cue, there was a knock on the cockpit door. First Officer Stevens opened it to reveal Sarah, the flight attendant who had been at the center of the incident. Her face was pale, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible distress. "Captains," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I've come to apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and Captain Chen held up a hand, silencing her. "Sarah, we'll discuss this in detail later. For now, I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Inform them that there will be a slight delay in our departure due to a crew change, and that I'll be addressing them shortly." Sarah nodded, her eyes darting nervously to Marcus before she retreated from the cockpit. As the door closed behind her, Captain Chen turned back to Marcus, his expression grave. "Captain Johnson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what you've experienced. This is not representative of our airline or our values. I'd like you to take command of this flight as originally planned, if you're willing. I believe it's important that our passengers see you in your rightful position." Marcus considered the offer for a moment. Part of him wanted nothing more than to walk off the plane and put this humiliating experience behind him. But a larger part recognized the opportunity before him, a chance to turn this negative situation into a powerful lesson. "I appreciate that, Captain Chen," Marcus replied. "I'll take command. But first, I'd like to address the passengers myself. I think it's important that they understand what's happened here today." Captain Chen nodded solemnly. "Of course, whatever you feel is necessary." As Marcus changed into his uniform, brought to him by a flustered ground crew member, he could hear the murmur of confused passengers through the cockpit door. News of the crew change had clearly sparked curiosity and speculation. Fully dressed in his captain's uniform, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin fell silent as he made his way to the front of the first-class section, all eyes following his every move. He could see the shock and dawning realization on the faces of the passengers who had witnessed his earlier confrontation with Sarah. Marcus picked up the intercom handset, his voice steady and clear as he began to speak. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Captain Marcus Johnson, and I'll be taking command of this flight to Los Angeles. Before we depart, I feel it's important to address a situation that occurred during boarding." He paused, letting his words sink in. The cabin was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Earlier today, I was asked to give up my seat in first class and move to economy, not because of any overbooking issue, but because someone made assumptions about me based on my appearance. I want to be clear. This kind of discrimination has no place in our society, let alone on our airlines." Marcus could see a mix of emotions on the faces before him: shame, anger, sympathy, and in some cases, uncomfortable recognition. "I'm sharing this with you not to assign blame, but to remind us all of an important truth. We must look beyond our preconceptions and treat each person we meet with respect and dignity. The color of someone's skin, their gender, or any other external factor should never determine how we value them as human beings." He paused again, his eyes scanning the cabin. "I've chosen to continue as your captain today because I believe in leading by example. I hope that by the end of our flight, we'll all have learned something valuable about judgment, respect, and the power of rising above adversity." As Marcus concluded his address, a slow, steady applause began to build throughout the cabin. It started in first class and spread quickly to economy, growing in volume and intensity. Passengers stood, many with tears in their eyes, offering a standing ovation that spoke volumes about the impact of his words. Sarah, standing at the back of the first-class cabin, looked simultaneously mortified and moved. As the applause died down, she approached Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Johnson, I am so sorry. I don't know how to even begin to make this right." Marcus regarded her for a moment, seeing not just the woman who had discriminated against him, but a person capable of growth and change. "Sarah," he said gently, "the first step is acknowledging our mistakes. The second is learning from them. I trust you'll do both." With that, Marcus turned and headed back to the cockpit, ready to guide not just the aircraft, but perhaps the hearts and minds of those on board to new heights. As he settled into the captain's seat, he felt a sense of purpose that went far beyond simply flying a plane. Today, he would not only transport passengers to their destination, but also, hopefully, move society one small step closer to true equality. As Captain Marcus Johnson disappeared into the cockpit, the cabin erupted into a buzz of conversation. The passengers, still reeling from the unexpected revelation and powerful address, turned to one another, their voices a mix of shock, admiration, and self-reflection. In first class, a distinguished-looking older gentleman leaned across the aisle to his seatmate, his voice low but intense. "In all my years of flying, I've never witnessed anything like this. It's a damned shame what happened to that man, but the way he handled it, that's true leadership." His seatmate, a young woman in a crisp business suit, nodded vigorously. "I saw the whole thing when it happened. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. God, I feel terrible now. We all just sat here and let it happen." Further back, in the economy section where Marcus had been relegated, the atmosphere was equally charged. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes wiped away tears as she spoke to her husband. "To think, we had a hero sitting right here among us, and we didn't even know it. It makes you wonder how many times we've misjudged people without realizing it." Her husband, a burly man with a gruff exterior, seemed to be fighting back emotions of his own. "You're right, dear. It's a wake-up call for all of us. We've got to do better." Near the back of the plane, a group of college students who had witnessed the initial confrontation were engaged in an animated discussion. "Did you see the look on that flight attendant's face when she realized who he was?" one of them said. a mix of schadenfreude and disbelief in his voice. His friend elbowed him sharply. "Come on, man. This isn't about gloating. It's about learning. We all need to check our biases. I mean, be honest. If you saw a black guy sitting in first class, what would you think?" The question hung in the air, prompting uncomfortable silence and introspection among the group. Meanwhile, the cabin crew was in various states of shock and dismay. Sarah, the flight attendant who had been at the center of the incident, stood in the galley, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. A colleague approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, are you okay?" the colleague asked gently. Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "How could I have been so stupid? So prejudiced? I've always prided myself on being fair and professional. But today I was everything I've always despised." Her colleague squeezed her shoulder. "What matters now is what you do next. Captain Johnson gave us all a chance to learn and grow from this. Don't waste it." As the initial shock began to wear off, passengers started to approach the cabin crew, asking if there was any way they could express their support for Captain Johnson. Some suggested writing notes of apology and encouragement, while others proposed a collection to donate to an anti-discrimination charity in the airline's name. The energy on the plane had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine flight had transformed into a powerful, shared experience that was causing everyone on board to reevaluate their own beliefs and behaviors. In the cockpit, unaware of the profound impact his words had made, Captain Johnson focused on the pre-flight checklist, his movements precise and professional. First Officer Stevens watched him with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "Captain," Stevens began hesitantly, "I just want to say, what you did out there, how you handled this whole situation, it's inspiring. I'm honored to be flying with you today." Marcus paused in his preparations, turning to face his co-pilot. "Thank you, Stevens. But remember, it's not about me. It's about all of us recognizing our shared humanity and treating each other with the respect we all deserve." As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, there was a palpable sense that this flight would be unlike any other. The passengers and crew had embarked on not just a physical journey, but an emotional and moral one as well. Little did they know that the most profound moments of their shared experience were yet to come. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, it carried with it the weight of newfound understanding and the promise of change. The sky ahead was clear, but the path to true equality and respect still had turbulence to navigate. As the aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet, the initial shock of the pre-flight events had settled into a deep, contemplative atmosphere throughout the cabin. Passengers sat quietly, many lost in thought, while others engaged in hushed, earnest conversations about what they had witnessed and learned. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Johnson expertly guided the plane through the sky, his exterior calm and professional. Inside, however, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions and reflections. He thought back to his early days in aviation, the challenges he had faced, and the countless times he had been underestimated or dismissed because of his race. Today's events, while painful, were unfortunately not unfamiliar. First Officer Stevens, sensing the weight of the moment, broke the silence. "Captain, if you don't mind me asking, how do you do it? How do you face this kind of prejudice and still remain so composed?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It's not easy, Stevens," he finally replied. "There are days when the weight of it all feels crushing, but I remind myself that every time I step into this cockpit, every time I put on this uniform, I'm not just flying a plane. I'm challenging stereotypes, breaking barriers, and paving the way for others who look like me." He paused, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's about turning pain into purpose. Every act of discrimination I face is an opportunity to educate, to change minds, to make things a little bit better for the next generation." In the first-class cabin, Sarah, the flight attendant, was grappling with the consequences of her actions. As she went about her duties, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some accusatory, others pitying. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her with each step. During a quiet moment, she retreated to the galley, taking deep breaths to compose herself. Her colleague, noticing her distress, approached once again. "Sarah," the colleague said gently, "I know you're beating yourself up over this, but remember what Captain Johnson said about learning from our mistakes. This can be a turning point for you if you let it." Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. "You're right. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. It's forcing me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself." Meanwhile, in economy class A's, the group of college students who had been discussing the incident earlier were now deeply engaged in a conversation about implicit bias and systemic racism. "I always thought I was pretty woke," one of them admitted, "but today made me realize how much I still have to learn. How many times have I made snap judgments about people without even realizing it?" His friend nodded in agreement. "It's not enough to just not be racist. We need to be actively anti-racist. Call out discrimination when we see it, even if it's uncomfortable." As the flight progressed, passengers began to write notes to Captain Johnson. What started as a trickle soon became a flood, with flight attendants collecting scraps of paper filled with apologies, words of support, and promises to do better. In the cockpit, First Officer Stevens received word of this spontaneous outpouring of support. "Captain," he said, a note of awe in his voice, "the passengers, they're writing you messages, hundreds of them. I've never seen anything like it." Marcus smiled, touched by the gesture but also aware of the larger implications. "It's a start," he said. "But the real test will be what happens after this flight lands. Will they take these lessons into their daily lives? Will they speak up the next time they witness discrimination?" As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, there was a sense of transformation in the air. Passengers who had boarded the flight as strangers now felt connected by a shared experience and a collective commitment to change. Sarah, gathering her courage, approached the cockpit during the final preparations for landing. "Captain Johnson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know my earlier apology wasn't enough. I want you to know that this experience has changed me. I'm committed to doing the work to confront my biases and to be a better person. I hope that someday I can earn your forgiveness." Marcus regarded her with compassion. "Sarah, forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you give, both to others and to yourself. What matters now is what you do with this experience. Let it guide you to be the person I believe you can be." As the wheels touched down on the runway at LAX, it was clear that this flight had been much more than a simple journey from New York to Los Angeles. It had been a voyage of self-discovery, a lesson in humanity, and for many, the first step on a long road toward true understanding and equality. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. There was a sense that something profound had occurred, something that couldn't be left behind on the plane. As Captain Marcus Johnson's voice came over the intercom one last time, thanking them for flying and wishing them well, the cabin erupted into spontaneous applause. It was more than applause for a smooth flight or excellent service. It was an acknowledgement of a shared experience, a collective commitment to change, and a recognition of the power of one man's dignity in the face of adversity. As the passengers disembarked, many lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse of Captain Johnson, to shake his hand, to express their gratitude. And as Marcus finally emerged from the cockpit, he was met with a sea of faces, all different, yet united in their newfound understanding. The impact of this flight would ripple out far beyond the confines of the aircraft. It would spark conversations in homes, workplaces, and communities. It would challenge long-held beliefs and inspire action. And for Captain Marcus Johnson, it would serve as a powerful reminder of why he continued to fly, not just to traverse the skies, but to soar above prejudice and light the way for others to follow. As the last passengers disembarked, the Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with an energy unlike any ordinary day. Word of the extraordinary flight had spread quickly, and a small crowd of curious onlookers and media had gathered near the gate. Captain Marcus Johnson emerged from the jet bridge, his posture straight and proud, his captain's uniform a powerful symbol of achievement and perseverance. As he stepped into the terminal, he was met with a spontaneous round of applause from those waiting. Passengers from the flight, airport staff, and even travelers from other flights joined in, creating a thunderous ovation that echoed through the concourse. Among the crowd, Sarah, the flight attendant, stood quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the applause died down, she approached Captain Johnson, her steps hesitant but determined. "Captain," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I've apologized before, but I needed to say it one more time. What I did was inexcusable, and I—" Marcus held up a hand, silencing her gently. "Sarah," he said, his voice kind but firm, "apologies are important, but actions speak louder than words. What will you do differently tomorrow, next week, next year?" Sarah straightened, a look of determination replacing the guilt in her eyes. "I've already spoken to our HR department. I've asked to be part of our airline's diversity and inclusion initiatives. I want to share my story, my mistake, to help others learn. And I've signed up for implicit bias training. It's a start, I know, but I'm committed to doing better." Marcus nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That, Sarah, is how change begins. One person at a time, one action at a time." As they spoke, a group of the passengers from the flight had gathered nearby. An elderly gentleman stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "Captain Johnson," he said, his voice quavering with emotion, "I've been flying for over 5 decades, and I've never experienced anything like today. You've taught this old dog some new tricks, and for that, I'm grateful." A young woman, the business executive from first class, chimed in. "You've inspired us all, Captain. We've started a social media campaign. Flying above prejudice is trending already. People are sharing their own stories and pledging to do better." Marcus was touched by the gesture, but knew that real change required more than hashtags and momentary inspiration. "That's a wonderful start," he said. "But remember, the real work happens in our daily lives, in the small moments when no one's watching. It's about consistently choosing empathy over judgment, understanding over assumption." As the crowd listened intently, a reporter who had caught wind of the story approached, microphone in hand. "Captain Johnson, can you tell us more about what happened on this flight? How do you feel about becoming an unexpected symbol for change?" Marcus paused, considering his words carefully. He was acutely aware that his response could shape the narrative around this incident and potentially impact many lives. "What happened today?" he began, his voice steady and clear. "It was not just about me. It was a mirror held up to our society, reflecting the prejudices that still exist, often unnoticed, in our daily interactions. But it also reflected our capacity for growth, for acknowledging our mistakes, and for coming together in the face of injustice." He continued, his words carrying the weight of years of experience and reflection. "I don't see myself as a symbol, but as a catalyst. If my experience today sparks conversations, changes perspectives, and inspires action, then something positive has come from a negative situation. That's how progress happens, not in grand gestures, but in countless small moments of awareness and choice." The reporter pressed on. "What message do you have for others who might face similar discrimination?" Marcus's expression softened, his thoughts turning to the countless individuals who endure prejudice without the platform he now had. "To anyone facing discrimination, I want to say this. Your worth is not determined by others' perceptions. Stand tall in your truth. Your presence in spaces where you're underrepresented is an act of courage and change. But also, don't carry the burden alone. Seek support, share your stories, and know that for every person who might judge you unfairly, there are many more who will stand with you." As he spoke, Marcus noticed a group of young aviation students who had gathered at the edge of the crowd, their eyes wide with admiration. He gestured for them to come closer. "The future of aviation, of our society, lies with you," he said, addressing them directly. "Dream big, work hard, and never let anyone's preconceptions limit your potential. The skies are for everyone." The students beamed, clearly moved by his words. One of them, a young black woman, stepped forward. "Captain Johnson, You've shown us that it's possible to break barriers. Thank you for paving the way. As the impromptu gathering began to disperse, Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find First Officer Stevens standing there, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Captain," Stevens began, I owe you an apology too. I didn't speak up when I should have. I was so focused on the protocols and procedures that I failed to see the bigger picture. It won't happen again." Marcus clasped Stevens' shoulder firmly. "Thank you, Stevens. Remember, being an ally means using your voice and your position to advocate for others, especially when it's uncomfortable. I'm counting on you to do that moving forward." As the day wound down, Marcus found himself in the airline's executive offices. The CEO, having heard about the incident, had requested an immediate meeting. Marcus entered the room, his posture relaxed but resolute. The CEO, a woman in her late 50s, rose to greet him. "Captain Johnson," she said, her tone a mix of admiration and regret. "First, let me personally apologize for what you experienced. It's unacceptable, and we will be taking concrete steps to address this at every level of our organization." She paused, studying Marcus intently. "But I also want to thank you. Your handling of this situation was exemplary. We'd like to work with you to develop a comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program for all our staff. Your insights would be invaluable." Marcus nodded, a sense of cautious optimism filling him. "I appreciate that, and I'd be honored to contribute. But this can't be just a reactionary measure or a PR move. It needs to be a fundamental shift in culture and policy." The CEO agreed wholeheartedly. "Absolutely. We're committed to making lasting changes. In fact, we'd like to offer you a new role, overseeing our diversity and inclusion initiatives alongside your flying duties. Your experience and leadership could transform not just our airline, but potentially the entire industry." As Marcus left the office later that evening, the weight of the day's events finally began to settle on his shoulders. He was exhausted, but there was a spark of hope burning brightly within him. He knew that one day, one flight, one conversation couldn't solve the deep-rooted issues of prejudice and discrimination. But it was a start. He thought of Sarah, the flight attendant, and her commitment to change. He thought of the passengers who had been moved to action, the young aviation students inspired to pursue their dreams, and the corporate leadership ready to implement systemic changes. As he walked through the quiet airport, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Today, he had done more than fly a plane. He had elevated the conversation, challenged perceptions, and set in motion a series of events that could lead to real, lasting change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to break barriers and change minds. But for now, Captain Marcus Johnson headed home, knowing that today he had truly soared above prejudice, and in doing so, had shown others that they could too. The story of Flight 1382 would be told and retold, not just as a tale of discrimination overcome, but as a beacon of hope for a more inclusive, understanding future. It served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important journeys we take are not those that traverse physical distances, but those that bridge the gaps in our hearts and minds. As Marcus stepped out into the cool night air, he looked up at the star-studded sky. The same stars that had guided aviators for generations now seemed to shine with a new purpose, illuminating a path toward a more equitable and compassionate world. And Captain Marcus Johnson, with his head held high and his spirit unbroken, was ready to lead the way.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.